At 8:32 a.m., the entire north face of Mount St. Helens collapsed. I was parked on a logging road miles north of the mountain that morning, looking at it through binoculars. Through the lenses, I saw the upper slope begin to slide. At first, it moved slowly. Then the entire side of the mountain started moving. Rock, snow, soil, and trees were sliding downhill in one mass. For a moment, I could see it moving and hear nothing. Then the sound reached me. It was louder than anything I had ever heard. The top of the mountain dropped hundreds of feet in seconds. What had been solid ground a moment earlier was now racing downhill. 57 people were somewhere inside the restricted zone around the mountain that morning. As the sliding rock tore away from the north side, it opened the mountain itself. Pressure that had been trapped inside escaped. A blast of superheated gas, ash, and rock burst outward through the gap left by the landslide. The explosion did not go straight up, it shot sideways. Through the binoculars, I saw a dense gray cloud race north across the ground. It moved so fast it looked almost like a solid wall rolling through the forest. The trees started falling before the sound reached me. Whole sections of forest dropped flat in the same direction. A few seconds later, the shock wave hit the truck. The air slammed into the vehicle hard enough to shake it. The windows rattled. Dust lifted from the road and drifted across the windshield. The radio in the truck burst into overlapping voices. One of them said, "Vancouver, this is it." The blast kept moving across valleys and ridges. Trees snapped or were pushed flat against the ground. In areas closer to the crater, the forest simply disappeared. Some timber caught fire from the heat moving inside the blast. Behind the sideways explosion, a massive column of ash started rising straight up from the crater. The cloud climbed rapidly into the sky. It kept growing darker and thicker as it rose. Lightning flashed inside the ash as particles collided with each other. Within minutes, the daylight started fading. 2 months earlier, the mountain had begun showing signs that something was changing. Back in March, people living near Mount St. Helens started feeling earthquakes. Residents said cupboards rattled and windows shook. Steam vents appeared near the summit. Light ash fell on cars and roads in nearby towns. Scientists began coming into the area with equipment. They placed instruments on the ground and checked the readings every day. Over time, they noticed the north side of the mountain pushing outward. The entire flank was slowly swelling. In some places, the ground was moving several feet each day. Officials eventually closed the area around the volcano. Roadblocks were set up along the access roads. Maps showed a restricted zone around the mountain. People who lived inside that zone were told to leave. Most did. Some came back anyway. A few cabin owners returned to check their property. Photographers drove in early in the morning to take pictures. A handful of workers remained inside the zone. They believed they were far enough away from the crater to stay safe. On the morning of May 18th, the earthquake at 8:32 a.m. changed everything. The north side of the mountain had already been pushing outward for weeks. When the ground shook that morning, the entire slope failed. The landslide that followed became the largest ever recorded. The collapse removed the upper part of the mountain and exposed the pressurized system underneath. With the pressure suddenly released, the gas and magma inside expanded violently. The sideways blast flattened roughly 230 square miles of forest in less than 1 minute. Inside the direct blast zone, there was almost no time to react. One volcanologist was stationed at an observation point north of the mountain. Over the radio, he reported that the north side was collapsing. His transmission stopped in the middle of the sentence. Several people inside the restricted area were in vehicles or cabins when the blast arrived. Some were later found beneath fallen timber and deep ash. Others were never recovered. From where I was parked miles away, ash began falling within minutes. Fine gray particles landed on the windshield and settled across the dashboard. The air grew thick with dust. Above the mountain, the ash column continued climbing higher and higher, eventually reaching more than 50,000 feet into the sky. Winds carried the ash east across Washington state. By late morning, towns dozens of miles away started going dark. Streetlights came on in the middle of the day. Drivers pulled their cars to the side of the road because they could not see. Airports shut down. Highways were closed. Ash clogged vehicle air filters. Engines stalled along the roads. People stayed inside their homes and placed cloth along doors and windows to keep the dust out. Hospitals treated people with breathing problems and irritated eyes. Closer to the volcano, new dangers were already forming. Snow and ice high on the slopes melted quickly from the heat of the eruption. The meltwater mixed with ash and debris, forming thick mudflows. Those flows raced down river valleys carrying logs, rocks, and heavy sediment. The Toutle River Valley filled with gray slurry. Bridges collapsed under the weight of the debris. Sections of highway disappeared beneath mud and ash. Rail lines twisted out of shape. Engineers downstream began watching dams and reservoirs, trying to calculate how much debris the structures could handle. The eruption continued for most of the day. Repeated blasts sent more hot gas and ash down the slopes. Additional explosions reshaped the crater. More ash kept rising into the sky. By evening, parts of eastern Washington were covered by several inches of ash. The cloud continued drifting east into Idaho and Montana. Livestock struggled to find clean water. Crops were coated in powder. Power outages spread across several communities. When conditions improved, helicopters began flying over the blast zone. From the air, the destruction formed a huge fan shape spreading north from the crater. Millions of trees lay flat in the same direction, pointing away from the mountain. In areas closest to the crater, the forest was completely gone. The summit of Mount St. Helens was now more than 1,300 feet lower than it had been that morning. Where the north slope once stood, there was now a massive open crater facing north. Search and recovery crews began entering the area days later, after the ash settled enough to move safely. Some victims were found in vehicles crushed by fallen trees. Others were buried beneath deep layers of ash. The final death toll reached 57. Hundreds of homes were destroyed. Miles of roads and railways were damaged or buried. In the weeks after the eruption, ash from Mount St. Helens circled the planet. Scientists studied the eruption closely. The sideways blast forced them to rethink how volcanoes could behave. Monitoring systems around volcanoes across the United States were expanded after the disaster. Cleanup operations continued for months. River channels were dredged to reduce the risk of flooding from the huge amount of sediment. Some parts of the blast zone remained closed for years. Inside the crater, smaller eruptions continued later in 1980. A lava dome slowly formed in the opening left by the collapse. Scientists established research areas inside the blast zone to watch how life returned. Within the first year, small plants began growing where the ash layer was thinner. Insects appeared. Birds started nesting among the fallen trees. Decades later, sediment from the eruption still moves through the river systems. The crater left behind by the collapse can still be seen from miles away. At 8:32 a.m., the earthquake struck. Less than a minute later, the north side of the mountain was gone. The blast had already crossed the forest before most people understood what was happening. 57 people were inside the restricted zone that morning. None of them came back out.